wanted bad. The widening easy street to fit more SUVs, to planting baby trees, to grow to shady peaks. A little shelter from the sun, or the upper tax bracket. Here on the cul-de-sac, we're not giving back to the community. Repent, cause we can't afford to be generous. There's closing costs and a narrow margin. So go on your degree, and we'll take you out to lunch. You can work for us, but you gotta eat them all up. Yeah, one more mouthful and we will be happy then. Yeah, one more mouthful and we will be happy then. Out west they're moving dirt to make a greater Omaha. Another franchise sold, so there's even more restaurants per capita. And they all got a drive-thru. Yeah, who's got time to dine? Although the floors are clean, the color scheme and comp will mess me every time. So no one stars in this cattle town. The semis pass making squealing sounds, and that's all you can eat. And they'll never get enough. They'll be feeding us. They'll be feeding on us. Just one more mouthful and they will be happy then. Yeah, one more mouthful and they will be happy then. All this golden fields, lovely empty space. They're building drugstores now until none remains. I've been driving now for 100 blocks on 50 collectors, 60 parking lots. 6, yeah, one more mouthful and they will be happy then. Whoa! Yeah, one more mouthful and they will be happy then. One more! Yeah, one more, one more, one more, one more. It's one more! Just one more! Just one more! It's one more!
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to another very special Note to File podcast. I'm going to go ahead and kind of take you guys off mute there. It is an icy day here in Oklahoma City, so it's been a lot of fun. But let's get right to it. Oh, let me stop that. Why is that happening? There we go. All right. New StreamYard. Actually, if you guys just want to go and introduce yourselves, I know today we're talking about, the recent cut to the NIH, direct costs. And I'll be the first to admit, like, I read about it when it first came out. Probably haven't kept up as well as somebody who's in the industry should. So we have people here today who are smarter than I am, keeping up better with it. So let's just go down the road here. Actually, Edie, you want to start? Just introduce yourself if you would.
Yeah, Edie Edens. I'm with Kulkarni Law Firm. I'm a research and regulatory attorney who exclusively focuses in this space and definitely have a lot to say. Can't wait to dive in.
You have a lot to say? That's hard to believe. I'm just teasing. Thanks, Edie. Always awesome to have you on. Jess, tell us about yourself.
I'm sorry, I could not find the unmute button. My name is Jess Thompson. I am the founder of Clinical Research Pro. We're an organization for clinical research professionals to educate and train one another and really build a community in clinical research, but also for topics like this. It allows us to pivot very quickly and tackle some of our problems that our clinical research professionals are facing. So looking forward to chatting about it.
Awesome. And then camera off, Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle. Camera off because I'm part of a state academic institution. So we'll go with Michelle and no picture. That way I can speak. Long history in clinical trials research, now in a patient-centered group. So this is, really important topic.
Thank you for jumping on. I mean, I've had conversations with people who are afraid to sort of be involved to different levels because, I mean, obviously we're talking about, people's livelihoods. So thank you for getting on. And I see Mitch on backstage. I'm going to throw you on, Mitch. So I hope you're ready.
Yeah, please get up here, Mitch. I think it's really hard. I think you have to, it's personal comfort, and then it's also your corporate comfort, right? Like I know I work at the firm I work at, we're covering this because we're a regulatory and research compliance firm. We're not going to talk about it, but we're going to the ends of the earth to clarify that we're not trying to have political debates while we're doing it. We're simply trying to focus on a situation that impacts all of us. And that's really difficult when you're immersed in an academic medical center and your signature or your title block has that logo on it. You have to be unbelievably careful. And frankly, most law firms probably wouldn't let me talk about this as much as KLF does. So I get that it's really hard out there.
Yeah, it's definitely something. I mean, and I don't spend a lot of time on social media aside from LinkedIn, but I did recently made like a Blue Sky account and went on there, and it was very difficult to sort of separate the political part, versus like what's actually happening, which I guess is fair as it is seemingly at least politically motivated. But nonetheless, Mitch, let me give you a sec to introduce yourself, man.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to make it quick. So co-founder, CEO of Diversa Trials. Also have a couple nonprofits that I'm a part of with Clinical Research Justice League and the Manasa Group. And I'm the head of site relations with Wide Trial, which is an expanded access focused company. This meeting today and everything happening is super important to me because the expanded access space relies very heavily on NIH funding as well. So,
see, I didn't even realize that. So amazing. Okay, cool. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna actually, Jess, I know this is something you've been going like super hard on. Also, guys, if you're in the comments, have questions, comments, please feel free. This is always meant to be sort of interactive and for the community. So please jump in, throw questions if you got them. But with that, Jess, you want to kind of set us up and kind of what happened? Where are we? Where do we think we're going?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So what happened is that on late Friday night, there was an order for NIH to cap all of their indirect funds on grants at 15%. That is a significantly large cap or gap in what is currently offered and what has been negotiated. So, sorry. Hey.
He has a very impassioned dog as well, who is also on the Save Science
That's
team,
okay.
if you guys didn't know.
Oh, this
So
is going on.
this
is going on the blooper reel.
yeah, Piper's furious.
Definitely. Loves to interrupt meetings.
It's good. I'll give you a second,
Oh my
Jess. You're
goodness.
good.
Okay, I'm so sorry, y'all. This is real life, right? Like, yes, Piper's really upset about this as well. You heard her yelling at the neighbors about it.
There you go.
So, okay, so what happened? 15% cap on the indirect funds for grants. Grants are broken into indirect funds and direct funds. Direct funds go directly to the scientist that is applying for the grant and their very specific project or their project team, right? And anything that is needed specifically only for that. If there's anything that's used within a university that's shared, so your IRBs, your contract offices, your lab spaces, your PCR machines, your all of these kind of things that cost a lot of money and you can't really pay for with one grant, all the other grants come together and pay for it. So with that, that's pretty much how it's been set up for a long time, as far as I know, as long as I've been in clinical research. But I think that there's some big topics here that we're not addressing. So NIH grants are incredibly competitive. You are going up against like 500 people, incredible scientists for every grant that you achieve. or every grant that you get funded. So also, you are already stripping that budget down as tight as you can. And those are negotiated with the NIH and with the government on actual costs. It's not just things that we pull out of the air. It's not that people are stuffing their pockets with money. You are paying for the research services. You're paying for lab techs. This is paying for lab techs, for space, to keep the lights on, to have IT infrastructure, to have all of these different things that we need in order to move science and research and healthcare forward in the country.
This isn't going towards these scientists, the rich scientists and their Ferraris.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
and if you know any bench scientists, they don't drive Ferraris. They make like $60,000 a year.
I would also make sure, not that I would interrupt you, Jess, at all, and please keep going, but I want people to understand that, I mean, when you're talking about a lab or a building or some of these core resources, most single grant are not going to cover all of it. So the whole point of the indirects is to add up between multiple grants, so that if you got 5% from one and 5% from one and 5% from one, when you finally got to 100%, you can fund a contract officer or a grant consultant or help contribute to your IRB or keep the lights on. So make sure that scope is in there as well, because people kind of confuse that. They think of it as like, well, if it's for that study, it should be a direct cost. Actually, no, that's not how it works. Lights and toilet paper are not direct costs. Only things like salaries and only equipment that is, incredibly necessary and not already communal can be included in those directs. So you're very limited there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Edie, for that clarification. So, for example, when I first started in research, I was a lab tech in the OBGYN department at the University of Washington. I was for the entire OBGYN department. I was a lab tech, and that's how the indirect funds covered me, because they couldn't afford one lab tech for every study. They had to take bits and pieces from these indirect funds to fund my salary. Same when I was a coordinator at University of Washington too, taking bits and pieces, because you're having to work on so many different grants to get the funding to have the people to do the job. The other thing on the side of this, and really important for this discussion, is the impact on the economy, because every dollar invested by the NIH brings back $2.46 to the US economy. And this is our pipeline for pharmaceutical companies. This is our pipeline for biotechs. I think that the statistic was like 99.1% of all drugs that are approved by the FDA start with NIH funding. So all of our specialists, a lot of our specialists are truly at academic medical centers, because they're not only able to treat patients, they're also able to do the science and the work to have new discoveries. So they're going to have a much lower salary so that they can actually do these things that other opportunities would not allow. So that's how this is kind of laid out. And this is why it's a problem, because it may be 30% is your amount that you get on an NIH grant for the actual work. And then it could be like 60% that you get on the indirects. So a lot of times the indirect fees are higher than the direct fees because of all of the components that need to go into that research study. So again, that's your IRB, your contracts, your everything that goes into clinical research, and make sure that we are keeping our patients safe. But even more than that, it's before we even have patients, it's the science as well. It's the bench scientists. It's operating in those labs. It's finding cures. It's finding those molecules, discovering ideas. So that is really what is at stake if this goes through. We organized a working group really late evening on Sunday. And because Jessica Rowe and I kind of just said, if not us, then who? And we brought together a lot of folks that we really feel, personally, and that, at first it was all personal connections that were super passionate about the industry, and they brought in their friends as well. So we've built this really cool group of over probably 75 people at this point, that are contributing to writing a letter, so that way we can give it to anybody who's interested to send to their state representatives. We originally were thinking that we were going to sign the letter, a lot of folks, but I cannot even tell you how many people have reached out to me and said, Jess, I want to help, but I don't want my name on it. I'm scared. And it's not only academic medical centers, it's truly everybody in this industry. And I understand that. I feel that too. But again, if not us, then who? So we've started the working group. We have a petition. We can put all those links. Brad, send you all, all that. Brad's in the group. So you can, you can share all the links.
Yeah, we'll post all those here on the
Yeah,
in
and
the
I think
next.
it's important to talk about too, like where are we at today as opposed to last Friday when we got this news, right? So this was supposed to be enforced by Monday morning, which is by all accounts a very quick turnaround for such a dramatic change. And you saw late on Monday that, and it went into effect yesterday, that 22 Democrat-based states actually brought a lawsuit that placed a temporary restraining order on this going into play. And then later yesterday, the AAMC, the Association of Academic Medical Colleges, filed a lawsuit that actually extended the restraining order nationwide. Now, that's not a full stop. That doesn't mean this is not going to go forward or there's not a lot of negotiation to come. But that's where we are at this exact moment in time as to whether or not this is enforced or not enforced, and whether or not organizations are having to negotiate at 15%.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here too. So there's a lot of this aspect for me is demystifying almost the misinformation that you might hear. These people that have strongly held beliefs with little evidence or data to support those beliefs. Oftentimes, one of the big pushes for these cuts that are 35% or greater of these costs. Jess already mentioned this benefit of $2.46 per dollar of funding in economic activity alone. But the push and this perspective that I've heard on why these were initially enforced, this 15% cap was initially enforced, is because there's this stronger encouragement for other investors or other funding aspects of the industry to pull their own weight. We get a lot of this, hey, somebody's got to pull their own weight. But the NIH actually did a study a few years ago. I think the results were a few years ago. I don't remember the exact date. We can share it in the chat. But the study found that $1 increase in publicly funded basic research stimulated an additional $8.38 to the dollar in industry research and development after 8 years. So, I mean, this aspect of pulling your own weight, there's a direct comparison over time of, well, yep, NIH is kicking things off with this $1 investment, and we're getting over 8 times the same amount of impact from the rest of industry and R&D on top of that. So you talk about like pulling your own weight. There's a substantial amount of work that already goes into that people are just completely missing because it's beyond NIH at that point.
Well, do you think so? Like, I worked at an academic institution, and my job was also partially grant funded when I first started. This was, a long time ago. I'm old now, but even then, I remember, seeing these lists posted online at different universities, and thinking like 70% overhead. I think I worked at a smaller university. I think it was still probably close to 50%. I think especially if you're a layman, like, that looks crazy, right? To think for every $1 million that you get, that's what, $700,000 in indirect costs that are also being attached to that. That was some of the conversation I saw. I think is, questioning that amount. And look, I'm not an expert. I don't know, and I think Edie, maybe something you had chimed in about, because I was never that clear how transparently that money's spent, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Just from an informational perspective, there's an incredible amount of compliance that goes into what you're allowed to even pitch at any percentage, whether it's 1% or 89%. And once agreed to, there's also an incredible amount of paper trail and compliance related to reporting and confirming that said money has only been spent as you said and as was approved. So I don't so much worry about the transparency. I understand the average consumer does not understand this. And even a lot of folks in the clinical trial ecosystem, unless you've lived contract officer life, right, or grant consultant life, or maybe you've never been in an academic medical center, maybe you really haven't experienced this. So I do understand completely from a numbers and sense perspective. In fact, Darshan and I were just talking about this, how do you explain this to the common consumer who sees 70%, sees maybe a fantastic, otherwise great research organization, but a prominent ones like, say, Harvard or Yale attached to that 70%, and they snub their nose. They go, no way, you're just trying to rip people off, right? And where I worry about this is if we have a lack of understanding and information at any percentage, and I know this particular administration is taking a lot of other steps unrelated to clinical research that may impact things like our supply chain or the cost of some of our supplies or the ability for us to seek talent outside of the United States and keep it here. If that cost increases, that means indirects go up too. So you're in the middle of a market where indirects may organically be going up, not because an AMC didn't do their job or is trying to charge off Yahoo. Rather, they have no choice. It has gone, the price to do business has gone up so much because of other economic decisions. And then you have an administration lowering at the same time. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and this is a point somebody else made yesterday, is that you don't see from an economic perspective, or even in the administration that we're currently under's perspective, blanket caps being appropriate given doing research in Boston or San Francisco is a far cry from doing research in Oklahoma City in terms of cost. And so even if we did say, hey, no one can go above 30%, there still has to be some geographical, jurisdictional cost of living analysis done here to say what's appropriate and what's not, or otherwise you have trimmed too much well beyond the quote unquote waste in a place like maybe New York or Boston, because it is so expensive there. And yet you might not have trimmed enough in Oklahoma City where it was least expensive. And so you're not actually accomplishing the goal that I know this administration is very driven to accomplish. Hopefully that helps answer that.
Edie,
I
that's
just wanted to
exactly.
jump. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. To have a bit more of a lay relation, the phrase location, location, location. And so the costs of living, the cost of being and cost of existing, as to your point, is very different per location. We can get into different details about, this institution or that institution having a higher percentage, but that location, I think, is a relatable point when we're trying to get our point across to folks who don't live in the clinical research space every day. Jess?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in too, just thinking about, okay, yes, that percentage seems high, but if you were trying to do this research outside of an academic medical center and you had to actually supply an IRB individual, you had to contract an IRB, you had to do everything else, contract a lab, buy the lab equipment, buy a contract to contracts personnel. You literally, all of this is paying for the expertise. So there is just so much misinformation, and the word direct versus indirect is it's not clear, right? So these are directly related to the project. These are used by the project. Everything is used by the project that is going into these grants, right? But in order to make this so it's cheaper overall, we are able to utilize indirect funds so that they share the resources, right? So you're sharing that PCR machine that may cost $50,000. You're sharing that lab tech that costs $50,000. You're sharing everybody. You're sharing the IRB. You're sharing those fees. And because again, if you're hiring each of these individuals separately, there's no way we could do research in this country. There's no infrastructure for it. We would be relying upon the NIH or whoever else is funding to provide the labs with those specific things in order for this to be processed. And even things like marketing, right? Where we're able to use, so I previously worked at Vanderbilt. We were able to market our stuff on Vanderbilt's website. We were able to market our things within the medical center, our clinical trials. We were able to utilize the infrastructure that exists, therefore saving money as well. So I think that is a big thing that we need that I see a lot of questions in the chat about this, about why indirects, why all that. Go ahead, Amy.
And the other question I'm seeing a lot of, both in the chat and elsewhere, is I think there's a misunderstood proposition that grants cover the entirety of research costs. So at a much higher 500,000 foot level, you have the issue that if you're not at a large academic medical center that has all of these resources and that is known to conduct research properly because of these indirect F&A resources, you're highly unlikely to receive grant funding at an NIH level. Okay, so there's a direct correlation there, and these are very competitive grants. And so these aren't just the resources once you accomplished receiving the money. This is all the resources that also go into writing the grant, submitting the grant, and ensuring that you can be competitive in getting the grant. Now, once you have the grant, the entire unspoken proposition between academia and federal funding, which if folks aren't aware, federal funding is the primary funding in academia and academic medical research. So it's very critical that we keep that pipeline. The proposition here is, look, you are a phenomenal clinician in your particular space. You're one of 3 people doing this in the world. And I know you could go out and make millions and millions in the private sector. But if you come to academia, not only do you get to treat patients, you get to do groundbreaking research, you get more access to grants, you get more access to particular patient populations, you get more resources. You're going to get paid a lot less. You're not going to own any of your own IP. That's what academia gets back from you, basically, for this trade-off, right? But you'll get the right to publish, and that's everything in academia, as we understand. But what folks rarely understand is even when we're charging 70% indirects, even when this is an R01 grant for millions, I assure you, the institution at which this grant is being held out is still paying and subsidizing for at least a small percentage, if not larger than what you expect percentage of each and every federally funded research project. So when people go, well, why can't we just cut down the resources? Why can't we centralize? Why can't we just reallocate indirects? What you're not understanding economically is every university, every academic medical center, unless you have an incredible endowment, and even then, this still may be true, is losing money on every one of these grants. So if you cut them from 70 to 50, if you cut them from 50 to 30, you didn't take them from whole to missing 20%. You took them from, they were already a 50% loss. Now they're at a 35% loss. And there's only so many of those hits you can take, no matter who you are, no matter how big your endowment is, before you have to make decisions, period. And those decisions don't just impact science and patients, which of course are our absolute priority. They also impact jobs. We're going to lay people off significantly in spaces where it's going to be very difficult to recoup that resource. And that could actually slow down our ability to perform the research in addition to be competitive for it. So I think it's important to understand that larger, look at it like you're the president of the entire organization and this is your budget we're talking about across everything, and realize you were always in the red on this and you were always subsidizing, and now you're going to be beyond in the red, right? It's not like you're going from black to red.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to touch on, I guess the human element, so to speak. Like Michelle, I know, Anana Michelle, if you will. Can you tell us, like, I mean, are there concerns, like, with, your colleagues or even yourself? Is this it has to be causing stress or at least confusion, right, at the sort of site level?
Yes. Yes to all of the above. Yes, I mean, and I'm looking at the comments, and there's relevancy for sure, about centralization and everything. And I think this is not a big surprise, and I think academic institutions have been moving towards a centralized model, in various ways. So that's not necessarily new. And of course, there's always work to be improved, but there's panic. I mean, there's panic because this isn't the only thing happening. There's panic because this is a piece of the rollout post January 21st or whatever, 20th, whatever. People, like, they don't know if they're going to have a job. And our unit specifically has worked because we're all soft funded. We have zero hardwired funding. So for folks who aren't familiar, that means that our team, their salary, all of our efforts, all the work that we do is completely funded by grants, contracts, and donations. So this big of a cut absolutely could mean personnel have to be laid off. And so for those, and oftentimes how it is, and if we have to get to this point, last in, first out. So those who were just recently hired, we also work, I'm pretty proud of it. We've gotten feedback from our team. We try to be as transparent as we can with our finances as a unit. But we also have to be honest. Like, if this were to go into effect, like legit happen, I don't know. I don't know that we could afford all of our team members. And if we can, for how long? And so we're trying to stay positive in the leadership team. But we just don't know, because it's not sustainable for all the reasons we've discussed here. Folks, so I'm talking about my unit, but, living in the circle that we all live in, we're not the only one. I have other friends, colleagues, etc. Like, folks are scared.
Yeah, no, I have to imagine. And I've had a little bit of conversation in the background with people who are, again, afraid to talk about it, afraid to be very public, but are obviously very, very scared. I mean, do we And to go even beyond that, like it's easy to be, I'm not in academia anymore. So it's easy to sort of like, all right, whatever. But, is there any other additional impact beyond academia after that? I mean, I know we've run NIH funded trials before, even as a private site, not so much currently, but what's the impact to the rest of the industry, if any?
I think it's important to understand the buckets. Like when you're talking about funding any type of research, whether you're in academia or a private site, you've got federal funds, you've got state funds, you've got federal pass-through state funds, which is a combo action, right? You've got industry, and when we say industry, we mean big pharma, or a pharmaceutical company, a for-profit company. And then you have charities and corporations, which are a whole different ballgame. And another piece of this whole puzzle is from that global historical institutional knowledge piece is that there's a reason the indirects at the AMC level off of the federal and sometimes state grants have gotten so high. When you balance them against corporations that do not approve higher than, for example, often 15% indirects, then the NIH is actually agreeing to subsidize essentially some of that research so your academic medical center will take both. So it's not only the AMC to subsidize, it's some of the federal grant mechanisms. And so some of the kind of overarching education and, if you will, pushback I've heard in the last few days is, well, maybe if some of these private corporations who only wanted to give 15% as opposed to 25 or 30, which still is not 70, right? But we're willing to contribute to the public good the way the federal government is and the way academia is, then we would have never hit 70. Right. So there's also when we decrease one area, another area has to increase and vice versa. When one area says, I will not pay more than this, then we go a different direction, right? And the funding mechanism. So I think there is room for categorical change here. And if we can get something positive out of that, hopefully that's it, right? That there's a more balanced approach across the board. Everyone has a responsibility to be a part of subsidizing research. I'm not sure why it ever became academia and the federal government's sole responsibility, right? But I think we've missed that in the conversation because that's where we're like almost demonizing the academic institutions and not seeing that there's a whole ecosystem in which this is playing out and happening. And the other part of it I would say is it's not only the academic folks who are really scared about this. You're hearing about this particular funding cap that would impact AMCs at the same time that you're also hearing about the federal workforce being cut almost by 50%. And that's going to include people at the NIH, and that's going to include people at the FDA, and that's going to include people at the Office for Human Research Protection and Research Integrity. So that in and of itself has its own impact to this and the processing of this. Like even if this was a well-oiled machine and we all agreed on 30% being the right cap, when you still have cut half the federal workforce that helps process these grants and negotiate these grants outside of the academic medical center, you've impacted how quickly the AMCs can move in, even if they agree to all of this, which of course they don't. So there's just multiple layers here. And of course, as we tie these up in the court systems, you don't know when that will resolve. You don't have an answer for that. So that leaves a lot of uncertainty for a lot of folks who frankly have probably been taking a subpar salary for their skill set at some of these institutions because they're damn passionate about what we do. And now you're really pushing to the brink of saying, I can't do this anymore, whether that's financially, truly, or because you laid me off. Or legitimately, you laid me off and I can make a lot more money doing something else. And I got to do what's right for my family. And what does that mean for a patient?
Yeah, Edie, I mean, you made a great point, and I want to kind of hone in on some of that stuff too, because it's not in the capitalistic nature to be a public benefit company, a PBC, right? These major pharmaceutical companies are for-profit companies. The drugs that they make stay very securely and tightly within their company. The R&D that they do stays within their company. When you have publicly funded research and the support from the NIH, back in 2023, NIH even has a data management sharing policy. So there's common data elements that have to be utilized to share this information and make the data that you collect interoperable with other studies and make it readily available for use because it is for the public benefit. And that's something that I think we need to continue to keep in mind where there's this call to action from industry, like, well, you do more. Well, they're doing more for them. They're not doing more for the general public. The general public and how we choose to spend our money and how we choose to fund research through NIH is for the public benefit and will remain that way.
You make a great point. And I think it's worth noting when we talk about centralization efforts of resources, it's not corporate, that's driving that. It's not industry that's driving that. You know who's put policies in place and pushed the federal government to make all the academic medical centers centralized and do it? The NIH. They're always on the cusp of centralization and better use of resources because they know that impacts so much of their indirects and this entire setup. So again, let's not villainize the folks who are really trying to actually use our resources better. I feel like we're
Right.
punishing them without giving them the resources to do it a better way.
I'd actually like to hop on that. So I worked at Vanderbilt on the NCATS grant. So that's the grant between 64 academic medical centers. And it's truly from the NIH to streamline research. So I know some people have commented on in here, why aren't we streamlining? Why aren't we doing that? They are. They absolutely are. And I think that's what is not recognized in the media today, because the people at these academic medical centers can't speak out. So what the NCATS grant is truly focused on trial innovation, research or recruitment innovation, and there's a trial innovation center, trial innovation network. They're doing all kinds of amazing things. They have actually went ahead and streamlined a contract, so that way it's easy for contracts to be written and approved at academic medical centers if they're willing to utilize that contract. There is smart IRBs. They can seed review from their IRB to a couple of the IRBs. I know Harvard and Vanderbilt are both in that list. I don't know if they have more now. They are working on this, and you can actually look it up. It's called the Trial Innovation Network, and I think it's trialinnovationnetwork.org or something like that. So that's the first thing that I wanted to hit, because there are things happening, and there has been a lot, working towards that. I've worked at academic medical centers, labs, CROs, and pharma. And I can tell you firsthand, the fat is not at academic medical centers. The fat is at CROs and industry sponsored. That is where the fat is there. And that's personal experience. I'm sure I'm going to get people coming at me for that, but personal experience, I have had to write grants and the annual review of grants and say exactly how much time, down to the minute, I have spent working on that grant. And it is horrible. It is so much work, and it takes you away from all the other things you should be doing, because you have to spend 5 days working on compiling all this information for all the grants you're on. So those are big things that are happening, and they're not shown, but they are occurring. And another thing, Brad, I wanted to hop on what you said. How does this affect the rest of the industry? 99.4% of drugs that are approved by the FDA start in NIH grants. We have no pipeline without this. We have absolutely zero pipeline. I understand that we want more pharmaceutical companies to come in and do things earlier on, but we've heard examples why that's actually not the perfect option, right? But more than that, why isn't pharma sitting here and saying, oh gosh, we're going to lose all of our pipeline? We should probably say something about this, because literally there's not going to be any pipeline. The studies that we work on, the studies we run, we're seeking FDA approval. And we're only going to have 0.6 of those now in the United States?
Well, and that also changes the regulatory prowess, if you will. So while no one is 100% subject by law or by guidance to FDA, who's outside of someone trying to approve a drug or device in the United States, it is a well understood fact that there are whole jurisdictions outside the United States who say, oh, you've already had this approved in the United States. Well, then you get an expedited pathway because we have so much respect for the process. And yes, FDA is not funding it, they're approving it. I know that's a separate issue, but this is where I categorically do not understand. And I'm open to anyone who wants to troll me and school me and all the other things. I mean, if I am in the Trump administration and I am all about this plan to make America first, right? Make America great again. This is what's been my standing statement. I'm going to make damn sure we stay a global leader in this particular space. I don't want anyone to question how quickly we approve things, how safe we are, how we are a global leader in healthcare and research and innovation. And while I completely respect wanting efficiency, and I don't know anyone in clinical research who would say there aren't a lot of things we could do better, I don't understand how this level of a change actually keeps America first and follows in that same. And maybe it's a lack of connecting the dots. Maybe there's a big picture strategy, like I know Brad and Jess and Mitch and I have talked about, and even anonymous Michelle over here. Maybe it was a first shot across the bow. You know, I'm going to go really low in my negotiation tactics so that everyone has to pay attention and come back to the table. Maybe that was the thought here, as opposed to it really being, we're going to actually reduce this to 15% and still say a global leader. But it doesn't compute for me. And I want someone to explain that to me desperately, because I'm trying to follow that line of thinking. You want to make America first? Great. I live in America. That works for me. Let's talk about that. How do we do that if we are cutting a workforce both in the academic medical centers and in the FDA and in the NIH, and we're cutting the funding, but we want to be first and we want to be even stronger at first, right? I'm not sure how that works. And for me, I also really worry about the cost. Like we said earlier, some of the supply chain and the issues and unrelated to clinical trial decisions that this administration are making are going to impact the cost of our research. So our indirects that are 30% today will be 40% tomorrow if we have certain tariffs. And if it's cheaper and easier to take some of our ideas or our APIs to China, people will. And that's a problem. And I don't think that aligns with what this current administration wants to happen at all. I really don't.
Yeah, Edie, there's aside from the issues I might have with the foreign regulatory bodies streamlining approval just based off the lack of safety and efficacy in their populations. I'll digress. So when you talk about the concern, it's 100% valid. I mean, essentially kneecapping ourselves cost-wise for publicly funded research. As Jess mentioned, it was with 99.4% of medicines FDA approved were funded by NIH, at least initially at some point. If we substantially kneecap ourselves there is going to be, like you said, that dependence, not just necessarily like on China, but, you know, even through other European countries and throughout Asia as well. But yeah, it just seems a little bizarre.
Well, it also hits me as like, so I'm thinking, I'm from Oklahoma, Texas. Everybody knows that. I'm always honest about that. So I'm just thinking Texas, your predominant healthcare institutions, if I have what I call stage 4 scary or a loved one does, are going to be based out of academic medical centers. I don't care if you're in Dallas or San Antonio or Houston. Anyone who's been to the TMC in Houston knows you can't go 2 seconds down that mile without hitting a different academic institution, all based in the state of Texas. Texas is a well-known conservative Republican state. I would venture to say that many of our elected officials who are from there support this move because they support the administration currently. Okay, that's fair. Do you understand personally, elected official, that heaven forbid a loved one or you have a unique situation where you need that innovation or you need that care? You just agreed to cut over $300 billion a year just for the state of Texas academic medical centers, just them alone, just their NIH grants. That's going to impact the care that you receive. I'm sorry. And the rarer your need, the more uncommon your disease, which is a lot of times why we seek out certain academic medical centers and why we seek out educational institutions. That's the stuff that gets cut first because it affects the least amount of people and it's a numbers and an expense game. And I don't think that's what an elected official in Texas is thinking right now. They don't want their loved one to not get excellent care. I don't really think that connection, and I'm not saying they're dumb, I'm saying rather, I don't know how much we're understanding the long-term impact here and what that then means for an individual who goes in for care, you know, a year from now or 2 years from now.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to happen to someone for it to be real.
Right. Well, so we have a comment in here about shifting focus to community settings as well. I couldn't agree stronger with that. That's something that I've been passionate about. And from the expanded access perspective too, Edie was just talking about how AMCs, you know, generally carry a lot of this burden when it comes to ultra rare diseases or oncology trials, right? It's not easy for all of our patients to access those studies, and the criteria is often wildly stringent. The expanded access field in the space we're trying to help grow and develop and create this better gold standard for quality here is designed to have almost research as a kicker, is the way I determine it. That's how I quantify it anyways, but it's treatment first, and it's being able to create those opportunities in those community settings for kind of this behind the scenes. It's behind phase 3, but it's somewhat this real world evidence data that we're collecting on these patients to give them something to try so they don't just have to go through grievance counseling because there are no other trial options for them.
So I actually kind of want to challenge this a little bit too, because if we're honest, none of our phase 2, phase 3s typically are at academic medical centers. Our phase 1s are, our preclinical is. It's very specialized. If we need a very specific oncology or diagnosis, in my opinion, the clinical research that needs to shift more to the community areas are those that are funded by pharma and that are funded once the discovery's been made and proof of concept has occurred, because that's not really what's happening at academic medical centers. Academic medical centers, there's going to be a lot of bench work. There's a lot of proof of concept happening. There's a lot of specialized phase 1 happening, and you can't do phase 1 everywhere. You can't do, because a lot of them are going to need overnight, stays and PKs and all these crazy kind of things. So yes, we do need to move it forward, but that doesn't have, in my opinion, that doesn't align with this argument. This argument is truly based on the work that only academic medical centers can do. Our standalone research sites can't do the same things in all situations. And I think Brad will agree to that as well. We have to have our academic medical centers to even get the research to our sites in the community.
Yeah, and look,
I'm also thinking that applies to investigator-initiated. Anything investigator-initiated that's subsidized at the academic level, that is much harder at a private site to subsidize. And I'll let others explain if we don't understand entirely what that means. But those are very targeted therapies that are incredibly beneficial for patients and exceptionally expensive.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I've been, I worked in academia. I hated it, and I've been at times, hard on the way academic centers work. But I think Jess's distinction is important and probably a little truer, so to speak. Like, I do think later phase research, yes, should get out into the community, but a lot of your preclinical, your lab work, even your sort of translational stuff, you can't hardly do it in a community setting. I'll tell you, I have doctors I work with in a community setting who want to do their own research. I'm frankly like, hey, sorry, I can't pay enough people to do it. It doesn't make sense for me to do it financially. I will run out of money, even though it's a good idea. So yeah, having and your investigator initiated stuff, and I think a lot of your earlier stuff there makes a lot of sense. Even your sort of like regular oncology is tough to do in a community setting where you're just not structured for it. Now, I don't know, maybe the truth is somewhere in between. I mean, if you go down the street to the oncology center, you got 300 trials. It's a behemoth. We've got a dozen, and they're damn near impossible to enroll. So we don't have the volume that that center does. So I don't know. Neither one is maybe perfect, but I think you do need that hub, so to speak, where those things can happen. But that's just my opinion.
Well, and I don't want us to be all negative here. I mean, I think one of the redeeming and really beautiful things about the Save Science group that's come together so quickly in the last few days that Justin, so many others have championed is we haven't just talked about what's wrong with us. We really have talked about what is the answer. Like, no one is saying that the current FNA indirect system is perfect or that is not a better way to address this. No one is disagreeing with the Trump administration over that. What we are saying is, could we have some conversations? Could we have some strategy going in here? Could we get the right stakeholders in the room? Will we really have a meaningful compromise and we get to root cause of why this continues to be at issue and why it continues to be expensive, and then have a meaningful dialogue on what makes sense in moving the needle and some amount of appropriate time to implement that. I mean, I'm the first in line to say efficiency, 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 and nobody likes waiting 2 years for a regulation to get updated. And I'm a freaking regulatory attorney, and I'll say that all day long. But 48 hours, especially on a weekend, to turn over something this massive is just unrealistic for anyone. I don't care how efficient you are and how tight your ship runs. And so I want to see a meaningful dialogue, but where do we go from here? Like, I'm not suggesting that this 50 to 70% model is ideal. I'm not suggesting that the idea that academic medical centers subsidizing is ideal. I'm not suggesting any of this is not up for discussion. And I don't want it to just be, we'll go back to status quo, because I understand why this current administration is saying, screw your status quo, we're breaking things and we're making no apologies. Okay, fair enough. But if what we move to next is just as broken as what we came from, that's not actually progress. And where we eliminate waste in one place, we will just create it in another, unfortunately. And again, I don't think that really goes back to what the administration's goal is. So how do we have a meaningful dialogue about a way to make better progress in the industry without kneecapping anyone, but also holding everyone accountable for their role in supporting this research, and doing it in a way that is more cost effective than what we're currently doing, right? I think that's where I'd love to see, once we get over the initial shock value and we know a little bit more about, the temporary restraining orders and what the courts are going to do, how do we have that dialogue going forward? What do we do? How do we fix it?
Yeah, I mean, I've had some of those conversations as well about even reframing, right? Reframing the terminology and how we can maybe better align these outcome goals, because the indirect cost being such a high percentage, well, it is vague, and we understand that. But we also understand where these indirect costs are going, where others might not. So how can we then take these normally termed indirect costs and reframe or restructure them into allocations, because they're not necessarily directly linked to a specific study in general, but how can we, right? Like, how can we maybe reframe them or reterm them so they become direct costs, because they do directly support these studies in general?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a lot of that communication, right? But the thing is, it can't happen overnight, like Evie said. And we need to look at, why aren't we looking at to see, okay, of those 99.4% of drugs that are approved by the FDA, how many of those are from what pharmaceutical companies, and when can they step in? Why aren't we having those conversations? But I think that the biggest part of this is that we're talking about it. We're educating people on what those indirect fees are, because whenever you just look at it, it looks terrifying. It looks like we're idiots. It looks like we're wasting all this stuff. And in reality, if you've ever worked at an academic medical center, if you've ever written a grant, if you've ever had to do the annual reports, you know for a fact that is not what's happening. And you can very quickly tell who has done that and who has not, because the opinions are very heavy and like not, I don't know, there's no empathy there for, and we see it a lot in our industry, right? We see sites versus CROs versus sponsors versus academic medical centers. And in reality, I mean, I've been really lucky to work at all of them. They all suck in their own way. And we need to talk about it. It's not anybody against anyone else. We need to listen to the problems. We need to talk about the problems. And we also need to educate the public on the problems, because we saw very quickly with COVID-19 what us not talking about this and educating our communities can do to our industry, because the people who are doing the work aren't the people that are talking about it. And that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people that have no experience have the most, blatant in your face opinions. And then when they start to realize what's going on, they dip down and start to be enlightened, but they never reach the same confidence level. So if you've never heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, I think this is a really thing that you see all the time in media. But it's something that, empowered us to step up and say, if not us, then who?
And I just want to answer a quick question we got in the chat right there, about how and if items considered indirect costs can be negotiated as direct costs. Because I think this is, again, with, a lot of information and a lot of outspoken individuals with a lot of opinions out there. If you haven't lived this life, you really might not understand, and you might think, and I've heard a lot of arguments in this space in the last few days, just reallocate. Come on, you just made $1 billion in research funding last year, major academic medical center. Just move some things around, just move the funding around. Well, unfortunately, that is actually not how the federal government allows us to work with their grants. So again, the direct costs are very, very narrowly defined, and indirect costs and direct costs do not overlap. You cannot move one to another bucket. That's forbidden. And you have to justify why something is direct or indirect. And then you have to report on how it maintains that. So if it's a pooled resource, if it's IT, cybersecurity, compliance, regulatory, and so on, those are things we can talk about in indirects. If it's a salary of your PI, that's going to come off direct. And it goes back to, again, even then, whether direct or indirect, these are shared across multiple grants at these institutions. It's not as if one PI is funded 100% on one grant. They're funded 10% on this, 20% on the next. So everything is split halfsies as many ways as you can go. So the notion that we're not spreading the resources around or trying to stay lean is just inaccurate. In fact, if anything, I would say we're spreading them too lean. In my experience, that's one of the shortcomings of AMCs is they don't say no, even when they don't have the resources to say yes, because they know no one else will say yes. And so they keep saying yes. And suddenly you have a PI that you figure out is actually on 120% of the grants instead of, the 100% they should be on. So I just want to make sure as we're wrapping up that we try to answer, a couple of those questions and just genuine curiosities, because I think, like you said, Jess, the more we talk about this and the more that we're at least just giving information so that individuals can have informed opinions, even if they don't agree or align with our own, that's all I want to know. I want to know folks are not, armchair quarterbacking when they don't know what American football even is, right? Like I want to make sure that we at least have the information before we make the decisions. I would like to create a space here before we close. I know we're up on time, but Michelle, was there anything else you would like to say? Obviously, no pressure if not. But I feel like we dominated this conversation a little bit and didn't create a space for you.
Oh, thank you. I was actually going to go right off of your comment real quickly. Academic researchers, they really do, for the majority, really want to do the best, and they will say yes to everything. My job is to help us say not right now. And so oftentimes the grants have a cap of direct funds. So to be competitive, you have to put in a proposal that promises the moon and the stars on a, I don't know, McDonald's budget or fill in the blank, budget. So you're going for Ruth's Chris on a McDonald's budget. Sorry, I'm not trying to endorse anybody, but that's kind of how it is to be competitive. So those direct funds, they don't cover what they need to cover. But if you in a competitive grant space, those researchers are going to say yes. And if this were to go through, I haven't even been able to wrap my head around what kind of decisions we'll have to make in this space. So yeah, I agree. There's no perfect system. I agree with revisiting the system, but this is not the way to do it. And it is causing a lot of, I like to say, inefficient processes to increase efficiency.
Yeah, and I know we are up on time. You guys, thank you for staying on. I'd like to just some quick final thoughts. I mean, from what I look, as some of the comments, I mean, this is like super bewildering to me, because at the end of the day, even with the cut from the statistics I read, we're talking about 0.05% of the federal budget to fuck over a lot of people as well as science in general, right? Like, this seems insane for what seems like really little to no true benefit. Again, my opinion. I'm also, happy to hear from you guys, and also like what can we do? Where do we go from here? I know that's a very loaded question with a lot of uncertainty still, but obviously there's a lot of talk and sort of organizing going on in the background. So just kind of keep that in mind. Maybe let's get some final thoughts from you guys.
I'll go first. I have to say I agree with you. I always lovingly share with people that I have the pleasure of being married to an actuary. So and I'm a risk management professional. So I'm always thinking of these situations. What is the impact? What is the percent impacted? And so you make a great point about the level of budget percentage here. And I want to make sure as we go forward, whatever decisions we make and whatever conversations we have, we begin to bring it back to where it makes the most impact, right? And we begin to point out where we could make bigger differences. And we own, right, more than just the negative, and look at ways to move forward in a positive way. But again, I don't want us, those who are for a cut like this, or who see this as a giant move forward and don't understand those of us who may be very concerned, I want you to understand that perspective of, we're looking at it going, but you're willing to spend 3 trillion on this, you're willing to do this on this, and you're talking about a very small percentage that we're asking for just to keep things moving. If that's really the concern, then what else are we going to do? If you want us to come to the table in our ecosystem and be really reasonable and compromise and suggest solutions forward, I'm going to need to be met with that on the other side of the table. And I think that's where the conversation goes. How do we get the right stakeholders in the room in a very civil way for a very meaningful discourse that moves the needle forward and isn't just bickering and backbiting? And I hope that we can continue to do that while also informing people and having these conversations where we say, like, what is direct? What is indirect? Like, how do you understand this? How do you break this down? So I'll be very interested to see and happy to keep having the conversation.
I agree with what you just said. I would like to remind folks that there are people involved in this. People are absolutely going to be affected. And if you think you, quote unquote, you are not affected, trust me, you don't have to go very far to find someone in your immediate circle that will be affected. Unfortunately, whether it's because of their health and not receiving the potential groundbreaking fill in the blank of whatever, or whether it's losing a job or some variation thereof. Trust me, you may think you may not be affected, but I can assure you it doesn't take 6 degrees of separation to be affected by this.
I'm just going to leave you guys with the numbers again, because I think it's important for us to keep coming back to it. Even the human side of things is incredibly important too, but I think that numbers are going to speak the loudest right now. 99.4% of FDA-approved drugs start at with NIH funding. Every dollar that's invested by NIH brings $2.46 back to the U.S. economy. Mitch mentioned another statistic that it was every dollar invested brings $8 and some change back to the economy. I'll ask Mitch to link that one because I do want to read that as well. But just to say, we have to speak up. We have to educate. People are making decisions about the future of science and clinical research and not understanding what all is at stake and what all this means. And that we are the experts in that. We have to make our voices heard. You can get involved at savescience.us. You can sign the petition at change.org/savescience. Again, whatever we can do here, and even calling your local representatives and just flooding the phone lines, flooding the mail, just again, to make it known that this is important for healthcare, for the economy, for science in general, and our standing in the U.S. as a leader in biomedical research.
All right. Thank you guys. Awesome discussion. I will post as many links as I can in the comments, so please check those out. That's it. Thanks, guys. Until next time.